A snarl ripped through the dusk. Teeth snapped shut a hand's width from a small bare arm. The boy screamed out and pressed himself flat against cold stone, too weak to even run. 3 wolves fanned out in front of him, heads low, shoulders rolling. Winter had made them lean and bold. The biggest one bared its teeth, and then a figure stepped between them. She didn't run. She spread her arms wide and stood her ground, putting her own body between the boy and the jaws. Her voice came out low and steady. "Easy now, easy." The lead wolf took one slow step closer. Her name was Wren Aldercott, and she was a healer's daughter, not a fighter. She had no blade, no fire, only her 2 open hands. What made a killing pack stop cold at the sound of one woman's voice? "Stay with me on this one." Now let me back up just a little so you understand what she was standing in. Greywatch Hollow sat at the far edge of everything. It was the last village before the trees turned into a forest nobody came back from. Past the mill, past the frozen creek, the borderland began, and the borderland belonged to the wolves. Everyone in the hollow knew that. Mothers knew it. Children knew it. You did not walk out past the mill at dusk. You especially did not walk out there in the deep of winter, when the deer were gone and the pack was hungry and desperate enough to come down toward the smell of smoke and livestock. That winter had been the worst anyone could remember. The wolves had taken sheep. They had taken a milk goat right out of the Fenwick pen, in the dark, without a sound. The men of the village had started sharpening things. They had started talking, the way frightened men talk, about torches and traps and finishing the whole pack off for good. There was a bounty now, a silver coin for every wolf pelt brought back to the tavern door. So you can see the kind of place this was, and you can see what kind of night it was for a boy with no coat to be sitting alone against the old mill wall. Wren knew that boy. Everybody knew that boy, and nobody claimed him. His name was Peter, and his mother had died of the coughing sickness 2 winters back, and his father had walked into the forest one morning and simply never come out. Since then the boy had lived on scraps. He slept in the mill loft when the miller wasn't watching. He begged at the church steps. Some folk gave him bread. Most folk looked away, the way people do when a thing is too sad to fix. Wren never looked away. That was the trouble with her if you asked the other villagers. She was her father's daughter straight through. Old Aldercott the healer had never turned a single soul from his door, not a stranger, not a beggar, not a stray dog with a broken leg, and folk whispered, not even a wounded wolf. He had died in the autumn. A fever took him fast. And Wren, barely 19, had buried him and kept his little house and kept his ways. She had been walking home from the Fenwick farm that evening. She'd gone to set a poultice on the old man's swollen knee, and she'd stayed too long, and the light had gone gray and blue and cold. That was when she heard it. Not a scream at first, a whimper, a small, thin human whimper coming from the direction of the mill. Any sensible person would have turned toward the village. Wren turned toward the sound. She came around the mill wall, and there he was. Peter pressed into the corner where the stone met the frozen mud, his knees up against his chest, his eyes huge. And spread out in a half-circle in front of him, close enough that she could hear them breathing, were the wolves. She had never been that near to them. Nobody had, and lived to describe it calm. They were bigger than she'd imagined. Ribs showing, yes, but the shoulders on the lead one were like a man's, and the lead one was strange. Its coat had a run of silver down the spine, bright even in the failing light, and where its left eye should have been there was only a seam of old scar. One eye, silver mark. She would learn its name soon enough. Ashfang. Wren did not decide to step in front of the boy. Her feet did it. Her father's voice was in her ears, the thing he said to every frightened creature, animal or child when he needed it to trust him. Slow hands. Low voice. Never show them your fear, because fear is the one thing they can smell. So she spread her arms. She made herself wide. She made herself a wall. Easy now, she said again. Nobody here is going to hurt anybody. The one-eyed wolf lowered its head and pulled its lip back off its teeth, and a growl came up out of its chest so deep she felt it in her own ribs. Behind her, the boy had stopped breathing. Behind the wolves, in the black line of the tree line, something moved that she did not see. But we're getting ahead of things. Here is where it turns. The one-eyed wolf took another step. Wren held. Her arms were shaking now and she could not stop them, but she did not lower them and she did not look away and she did not run. She looked straight into that single amber eye and she kept talking, low and slow, the way you'd talk to a spooked horse or a dying man. "I know you're hungry," she said. "I know it. You've got a whole winter in you and no meat in the woods. I understand. But this one's just a pup, same as you once were. You leave the pup alone. Now I want you to understand something about what she was doing because it matters for everything that comes after. She wasn't brave the way the men in the tavern used bravery. She wasn't standing there to prove a thing. She had simply looked at a starving orphan and a starving animal and decided, without any thought at all, that neither of them was going to die if she could put her own body in the way of it. That is a rare thing, rarer than you'd like to believe. And it was about to be seen by exactly the wrong person, or, as it happened, the only right one. The wolf lunged. It was fast, faster than anything that size has a right to be, and it closed the gap and its jaws snapped and Wren felt the wind of them against her wrist. She did not pull back. That was the thing. Every instinct in her body screamed to yank her arm away, and if she had, the boy would have died because the wolf would have read the flinch as prey breaking. She held. She held with her arm out and her palm open and her voice never rising, and she said, "No, not tonight." And the wolf stopped. Its jaws were an inch from her open hand. She could feel the heat coming off its muzzle, and then, slowly, its ears came up off its skull. Its head tilted. That one amber eye moved across her face, up and down, like it was reading something written there that it had seen before a long time ago. The growl in its chest died down to nothing. Then it did a thing that made the hair stand up on the back of her neck. It leaned in. It pushed its great scarred head forward, against her open palm, and let her hand rest on its skull the way a dog leans into the hand of someone it has decided to trust. And it made a low sound in its throat that was not a growl at all. It was almost a question. Wren stood there with her hand on the head of a wolf that had been about to kill her, and she did not understand a single part of what was happening. Then a voice came out of the trees. "Ashfang, enough." It was a man's voice. Deep quiet used to being obeyed, and the moment it spoke, all three wolves changed. They turned from the boy and the woman as though a string had been cut, and they folded down onto the frozen ground, chests low, heads down, tails still. They knelt. I know how that sounds. Wolves do not kneel. But that is the only word for what she saw. They lowered themselves before the man who stepped out of the tree line, and they held there and they waited. He came into the last of the light slowly. He was tall and broad through the shoulders, and there was a stillness in him that was more frightening than any snarl. A long dark coat, worn at the edges. A face that had not smiled in a long time. Across one cheekbone ran a scar, old and pale, and his eyes found Wren and stayed there, and there was something in them she couldn't name. Not a threat. Something worse. Something like grief. He looked at the wolves kneeling in the mud. He looked at the boy in the corner. And longest, he looked at Wren with her hand still resting on Ashfang's scarred head. For a moment nobody moved and nobody spoke. The wind came down off the ridge and moved through the mill and made the old wheel creak, and that was the only sound in the whole world. Then the man let out a long breath, and his shoulders came down, and the danger seemed to drain right out of the clearing. The wolves rose and drifted back toward the trees, quiet as smoke. Ashfang gave Wren's hand one last push with his muzzle and turned and went with them. The man stepped back into the shadow of the mill wall and lowered his eyes, and it was as though a door had closed. Wren didn't wait to understand it. She dropped to her knees and pulled the boy into her arms, and he clung to her and shook, and she rocked him, and she whispered that it was over. It was over. They were gone. You're safe now, and she believed it. She truly did. She got her breath back. She wiped the boy's frozen face with her sleeve. She looked around the empty clearing at the trampled mud and the drifting quiet, and she thought, with the whole of her heart, that the worst thing that could happen tonight had already come and gone. She was wrong. It hadn't even started. Because down the path from the village, faint at first and then not faint at all, came the orange bob of torchlight. And voices. Men's voices, a lot of them, and the hard, bright ring of a blade being drawn. Someone had seen the wolves come down, and the men of Greywatch Hollow were coming to collect their silver. Now everything changed, and it changed fast, so keep up with me. The first torch came around the mill, and Wren threw up a hand to shield her eyes. There were 6 of them, maybe 7. Fenwick's 2 sons, the blacksmith, the miller, men she had known her whole life, and every one of them had steel in his fist or a bow on his back. And at the front, holding the biggest torch, was a heavy-shouldered man named Garrick Vane, the closest thing the Hollow had to a magistrate and the man who'd put up the bounty in the first place. They pulled up short at the sight of her. "Wren," Garrick said. His eyes went past her into the tree line, hunting. "Where's the pack? We tracked them here. They're gone," she said. She stood up and put the boy behind her again. "You see how that keeps happening," and she kept her voice level. "There's nothing here. Go home." "Nothing here," Garrick repeated. He crouched and put 2 fingers in the frozen mud, in a wolf print as wide as his own spread hand. He stood back up slow. "Girl, there were 3 of them not a minute ago, and you're standing in the middle of it without a scratch." He looked at her the way you'd look at something that didn't add up. "How is that? And here, this is the part I want you to catch, because this is where the whole night turned into something else." One of the Fenwick boys lifted his torch higher, and the light reached back along the mill wall, and it caught the man standing in the shadow. Just for a second. Just the edge of that scarred face and the long dark coat. The blacksmith made a sound like all the air left him at once. He took a step back and nearly dropped his hammer. "That's him," he said. His voice had gone to a whisper. "That's the Thorn. That's the wolf devil. Garrick, that's the exiled king. I have to stop and tell you who that man was, because until this moment even Wren didn't know. His name was Caelan Thorn, and 11 years earlier he had been Alpha King over every league of forest from the Greywatch Ridge to the sea. Not a king of men. A king of the wild country and the wolf-blooded folk who lived in it, an old line, older than the village, older than the church on the hill. There are places on the edge of the map where such things are still true. Greywatch Hollow was one of them, whether the churchgoers liked to admit it or not. Caelan had been betrayed by his own brother, cast out, hunted. His people scattered or killed. And for 11 years he had lived alone in the deep forest with the last loyal remnant of his pack, 3 wolves now, where once there had been 40. He had watched the village from the trees for years and never once come near it. He had let them believe he was dead. He had let them believe he was a devil. It was easier. It kept them away. And tonight he had broken 11 years of silence and stepped out of the shadow into torchlight in front of the very men who'd hunt him for sport. For a beggar boy and a healer's daughter he had never met. Now you might be wondering why. Why break cover now? Why for her? Hold on to that question, because the answer is the whole heart of this thing, and it's coming. Garrick Vane raised his torch toward the wall. "Thorn," he said, and his voice shook a little despite himself. So the stories were true. He gathered the men with a glance. 11 years we thought we were free of you. The bounty on a wolf is silver, friends. I wonder what the bounty on the Wolf King's head might be. And the men spread out. But before they could take 3 steps, Wren was there, between them and the wall, arms out, again. The same girl, the same open hands, the same low, steady voice. "Stop," she said. "All of you stop. He didn't do anything. He called the wolves off. He saved the boy's life and mine, and you're going to put steel in him for it." She turned on Garrick. "You've known me since I was small. You knew my father. My father would have stood right here in this same spot. You know he would. And that stopped them, because it was true and everyone there knew it was true. I'm going to pause here for just a breath because this is the right place for it. If you've stayed with me this far, if you feel the weight of this the way I do me one small kindness and tap that subscribe button. It tells me you want the rest of these stories told, the ones about the people who step in front of the wolves instead of running. That's all. Now let's finish it because it's about to break your heart in the best way. Garrick Vane was not a bad man. He was a frightened one, and frightened men do bad things easily. He looked at Wren, and at the boy peering out from behind her, and at the tall figure by the wall who hadn't moved or raised a hand. And you could see him weighing it. Silver against conscience. The safe old lie of the wolf devil against the plain sight of his own eyes. He chose the silver. Take him, Garrick said. What happened next happened in the space of about 10 heartbeats, and Wren remembered every one of them for the rest of her life. The blacksmith came first, hammer up. Caelan Thorne finally moved off the wall, and he moved to put himself in front of Wren and the boy, not to fight, mind you, but to shield them, which meant his back was to the men and his hands were empty. The blacksmith swung the hammer at the back of his skull. Wren screamed. And out of the black trees came the pack. They came silent and low and fast, 3 gray shapes pouring across the frozen ground, and Ashfang hit the blacksmith in the chest and drove him down before the hammer could land. The other 2 came in on either flank, and they did not tear, they did not kill. This is the thing. They could have opened every throat in that clearing, and they didn't. They herded. They snapped at heels. They drove the men back into a tight, stumbling knot, torches waving, and they held them there, snarling, a living wall of teeth. And in the middle of it, Caelan turned, and for the first time he spoke to Wren directly, close, his voice low under all the noise. You have to go, he said. Take the boy. Now, while they're penned. They'll kill me tonight or another night, it doesn't matter, but they will kill you too if you stand with me. Go. And Wren, you already know what she did. She didn't go. She reached out and she caught his sleeve, the way she'd held her ground in front of the wolf, the way she'd stood in front of the men. No, she said. I'm not leaving you to them. I don't run. I've never run. My father raised me not to run. And that word father did something to Caelan Thorne's face that 11 years of exile hadn't. It cracked it wide open. He looked at her, really looked, and his voice came out rough. Aldecott, he said. You said your name is Aldecott. Your father was the healer. The one who buried no one he could save. He was, Wren whispered. He died this autumn. How do you? And here it is. Here's the reason he stopped her from running. Here's what left her standing in the frozen mud, unable to speak. Caelan went down on one knee in front of her, right there, right in the middle of the snarling and the torchlight, and he put his hand flat on Ashfang's silver-marked skull, on that one-eyed head, and he said, 12 years ago this wolf was a pup with an arrow through his eye, dying in a snare at the edge of your village. My pack couldn't free him. The iron was too much for us. And a man came out of the hollow at dusk, alone with no weapon, and he knelt down in front of my whole pack, 40 wolves, girl, 40, and he did not show one flicker of fear. He said, slow hands, low voice, nobody here is going to hurt anybody. And he cut the snare, and he drew the arrow, and he saved this wolf's life, and he walked back to his village, and no wolf of mine has ever touched a soul of Greywatch Hollow from that night to this. Not one. We took your sheep this winter because we were starving. We never once took a person. Do you understand why? Wren couldn't answer. There were tears on her face and she hadn't felt them start. Because of him, Caelan said. Because your father showed my pack mercy when there was no reason on earth to expect it, and my pack has honored his blood ever since. That is why Ashfang put his head in your hand tonight instead of your throat. He knew you. He smelled the healer's blood in you before you ever spoke. And I. His voice broke. I stood in these trees 12 years ago and I watched a village man walk unarmed into my pack out of pure mercy. And I thought, There is one good soul left in the world of men. And then they exiled me and hunted my people, and I decided I had been wrong, that mercy was a thing I'd imagined. For 11 years I believed it was gone from the earth entirely. And tonight I looked out from those trees, and I saw a girl spread her arms in front of my wolves for a beggar child who could give her nothing back. And I knew whose daughter you were before I ever saw your face, because there is only one bloodline in this whole cold country that walks toward the wolves instead of away. He rose. He was crying too now, this exiled king, this man they called a devil, and he didn't hide it. I couldn't let you run, he said, because I have spent 11 years thinking the last good thing was dead, and it was standing right in front of me alive, and I would rather they cut me down where I stand than let it walk into the dark and disappear again. Now, the men. Garrick Vane had heard all of it, every word over the snarling and the torchlight. And I told you he wasn't a bad man, only a frightened one. Something in him gave way. He looked down at the blacksmith's hammer lying in the mud where it had fallen. He looked at the wolves that had had every one of them at their mercy and killed no one. He looked at the boy, Peter, that half the village had let starve without lifting a finger, and he looked at the girl who'd stepped in front of everything. He let the torch fall to the ground and put it out under his boot. Old Aldercott pulled a splinter out of my hand when I was 8, he said, to nobody, to everybody. Wouldn't take a coin for it. He was quiet a long moment. Call them off, Thorn. Call your wolves off. Nobody's collecting silver tonight. Caelan made a low sound, and the pack broke away, backed off, melted into a loose ring at the edge of the light. The men lowered their weapons one by one. The blacksmith got up out of the mud, rubbing his chest, and God's truth, he laughed once, shaky, the laugh of a man who'd been let out from under something. And that was how the longest night in the history of Greywatch Hollow finally began to end. Not with a pelt nailed to the tavern door, with a lot of grown men standing quiet in the cold, ashamed of themselves, and a healer's daughter kneeling in the mud with a beggar boy in her arms and a wolf's head against her shoulder. They didn't all become friends. Let me not tell you a fairy tale. Fear that old doesn't die in one night. But something shifted in the hollow after that, and it never fully shifted back. They buried the bounty. Garrick Vane saw to it himself, and any man who spoke of wolf pelts after that got a long, cold look and nothing more. Through the rest of that hard winter, the village left meat out at the edge of the mill field, the bones and scraps they could spare, laid on the frost for the pack that had held its teeth when it could have used them. The wolves took the meat and killed nothing that belonged to anyone. It was a kind of peace, an old one really, the kind Wren's father had made 12 years before, coming back to life. The boy came home with Wren that night, and he never left. She fed him and put him by the fire, and he fell asleep before he'd finished the bread, worn out from a whole life of being afraid. In the morning he called her Wren, and by the spring he was calling her something else, something that made her go quiet and blink hard and turn to the fire so he wouldn't see her face. She raised him as her own in the healer's little house at the edge of the village, and she taught him the things her father had taught her. Slow hands, low voice, never turn a soul from your door. He grew up strong and kind and utterly without fear of the forest, and why would he be afraid of it when the wolves knew his scent and let him walk among the trees like one of their own? And Caelan Thorn, he didn't come into the village, not that winter, not for a long while. 11 years of exile don't wash off in a night, and the men of the Hollow weren't ready, and neither, I think, was he. But he stopped being a shadow. On the cold blue evenings, Wren would walk out to the mill field at dusk, the very place, the very hour, and he would come out of the tree line to meet her, with Ashfang at his heel, and they would stand and talk in the failing light. About her father, about his lost people, about the long years each of them had spent believing they were the last of a kind that had gone out of the world. They were not the last. That was the thing they'd each been wrong about. They'd found the other one, I won't dress it up. There was no crown handed back, no throne. Kalen Thorne never ruled again over League or Pack the way he once had. What he got instead was smaller, and I'd wager worth a great deal more. A girl who walked toward him at dusk instead of away. A boy who ran out to meet the great one-eyed wolf without a flicker of fear and buried both hands in his silver ruff. A fire and a door and a family at the edge of a village that slowly, warily, stopped calling him a devil. Years later, when Pieter was grown, folk in the hollow told the story of the night the Wolf King came out of the trees. They told it 100 ways, but the ones who'd been there always came back to the same picture, the one none of them ever forgot. A girl in the frozen mud, no blade, no fire. Just her two open hands spread wide, standing between the wolves and a frightened child, refusing to move, refusing to run. She thought no one was watching. That was the whole beauty of it. She did it when she believed there was no one there to see, no reward, no witness, nothing to gain and everything to lose. That is what mercy is when it's real. You do it in the dark for a stranger expecting nothing. And a broken king watched from the trees and it saved him. Not her life, his. It gave him back the one thing 11 years of exile had taken, the belief that there was still something in this cold world worth stepping out of the shadows for. So when people ask me what made a killing pack stop cold at the sound of one woman's voice, I tell them the truth. It wasn't the voice. It was the blood in her and the man who taught her, and a mercy passed down like a lamp from one open hand to another, healer to daughter, daughter to child, on down the years. The wolves knew it before anyone. They always do.